Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
An appalling tragedy that should never have happened. That's what the Prime Minister called the contaminated blood scandal of the 1970s and 80s. The government today announced an inquiry into the worst treatment scandal in the history of the NHS. At least 2,400 people died and 7,500 patients were infected with viruses such as hepatitis C and HIV after being given blood products by the NHS. Our health editor Hugh Pym reports.
It's been called the worst disaster in the history of the NHS. Patients trusted the service to deliver safe treatment, including haemophiliacs needing blood clotting agents. But they were given products tainted with life-threatening viruses.
So these are the medications for HIV. I take one of those in the morning and one of these both morning and night time.
Andy has had a life on medication because he was given contaminated blood. At the age of 5, he was infected with HIV and hepatitis C. At 16, he developed AIDS. Since then, all he's wanted is answers.
I'm very worried that there was deliberate acts behind these infections. As I say, at the very minimum, we were let down. At the worst, I think there are people to blame for a lot of the infections that occurred.
Much of the inquiry's focus will be on Whitehall and what was happening here more than 30 years ago. Victims and their families have long argued that senior government officials were aware of the dangers with contaminated blood products, but allowed patients to continue receiving them. And after that, they say, there was a cover-up. A Scottish inquiry by a Judge Lord Penrose was dismissed by victims as a waste of time, and they showed what they thought of it. An earlier inquiry in England was privately funded with no official status. Today, a Labour MP who's campaigned on the issue told the Commons those affected by the scandal were owed a debt of justice.
They deserve to be told what went wrong, why it went wrong, and who is responsible for what happened. The story of the injustice they have suffered also needs to be set out and told to the wider public. Their voices need to be heard.
And a minister citing allegations that medical records were tampered with announced the new public inquiry.
In light of these concerns and of reports of new evidence and allegations of potential criminality, we think it is important to understand the extent of what is claimed and the wider issues that arise.
The former Health Secretary Andy Burnham, who alleged there was a criminal cover-up, says victims were failed by successive governments.
All political parties have let down those who've suffered as a result of contaminated blood, and all parties must now put differences aside, work together and give them truth and justice without any further delay or obstruction.
And for this campaigner who has hepatitis C, there's only one thing which really matters.
Nobody here is going away. We are staying, we're going to fight, and we want to know the truth. We just want the truth. That is all. That is all.
Whether that full truth emerges after this long campaign will depend on what sort of inquiry is convened and its powers.
And Hugh is with me now. This is decades later. Why has this inquiry been announced now, and what could it achieve?
Well, Sophie, government sources are making clear that new evidence has emerged just in the last few weeks, including some published in a newspaper, and the material that Andy Burnham was about to publish. That is their stated reason. But there is a political aspect to this. Only on Sunday, the leaders of the main political parties at Westminster, opposition parties, all signed a letter calling for just this sort of inquiry. And today there was a debate scheduled in the House of Commons called by a Labour MP to debate the issue, and there was a possibility that all the opposition parties might have voted on it. And of course we have new parliamentary arithmetic. So just before the debate began, Downing Street sources indicated the government was minded to set up this inquiry. It came as a surprise to the Scottish government. It will be a UK-wide exercise. They said they'd had no warning and they'd need to have a think about it. But whatever the reasons, whatever the timing, victims and their families are saying they're pleased it's happening, but they won't be content unless it really does get to the truth.
Our health editor Hugh Pym, thank you.
Here, an inquiry is to be held into the contaminated blood scandal, which left at least 2,400 people dead. Theresa May said it would establish the causes of what she said was an appalling injustice that led to thousands of NHS patients given blood products infected with HIV and hepatitis C in the 70s and 80s. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald reports.
For decades, victims and their families have asked, begged, cajoled, lobbied, campaigned for an inquiry into contaminated blood, all to no avail until now. It came out of the blue, literally half an hour before an emergency debate here in the House of Commons was due to begin. Downing Street suddenly announced that there would be a public inquiry into the tainted blood scandal, or at least they would begin consulting on what sort of inquiry it should be. Nobody was expecting this. 7,500 NHS patients are known to have been infected with hepatitis C and HIV during the 70s and 80s. That blood mainly imported from abroad. The actual figure, though, could be as high as 30,000. It's estimated, too, that at least 2,400 people have died as a result. Today, that emergency debate in the House of Commons went ahead anyway.
Had more than 2,400 people died over the course of one day or 1 year, it would have been inconceivable for any government to refuse calls for a public inquiry. Yet the devastation caused by the contaminated blood scandal has been spread not over days or years, but over several decades.
Dave Gort, a 39-year-old with haemophilia, was infected more than 20 years ago.
I wasn't told until I went to adult care that I'd contracted hepatitis C. I suspect that the Children's Hospital knew that I'd contracted hepatitis C, but I wasn't told till the age of 15 and going into adult care that I'd actually been given it. So I think for me personally there was some cover-up there. And then having, hepatitis C, and a lot of people got HIV as well, that carries a stigma with it in itself. So not being able to tell friends, I covered it up, I didn't tell anybody until, for me, it actually became life-threatening.
So what are the questions that need answering? The former Health Secretary, Andy Burnham, recently described tainted blood as a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. But also, why was risky blood imported from America? Why were some people not told they were infected? Were documents destroyed? This is what the former Health Minister, Lord David Owen, told us in 2007.
When I found that my own papers, when I was Minister of Health, were no longer available to me in '87, because apparently under a 10-year rule they had all been scrapped, I was pretty suspicious.
There have been inquiries. Lord Penrose in Scotland in 2015. That was described by campaigners as a whitewash. They even tried to set fire to it. And in 2009, the Independent Archer Inquiry, which was set up by Lord Morris, was published. But that was limited by redacted or missing Department of Health documents. Critically, though, neither Penrose nor Archer had the powers to hold anyone to account. Now, finally, an official UK-wide inquiry with promises that all those affected and infected will decide exactly what form it will take.
Well, let's have more now on the government's announcement of an investigation into the blood contamination scandal that led to the deaths of more than 2,000 people. I'm joined from Westminster by the Labour MP, Diana Johnson, who's long campaigned for an inquiry. And with me here in the studio is Andy Evans, who was infected with HIV when he was just 5. Andy Evans, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, that's quite astonishing to have been infected at the age of 5. You've lived with that all your life. What impact has this horrendous scandal had on you?
Well, as you say, I was infected at 5 years old with both HIV and hepatitis C and hepatitis B. For somebody who was infected that young and has lived with it for their entire life, I've never really known anything different. And of course, my parents told me when I was 12 years old, and at that age you're invincible, aren't you? And I think I made some throwaway comment like, I'll just have to become a doctor and cure myself then. But as time progressed and I headed towards my late teens, I started to get ill with the HIV virus, and I was actually diagnosed as having full-blown AIDS when I was 16 years old, which was at a time that there weren't any proper medications around for HIV. It was at the forefront of AIDS that we were actually infected. There's nobody alive older than us, than the haemophiliacs who have HIV and AIDS.
Because you are a haemophiliac, I should have said that as well.
That's correct, yes. I was infected through my haemophilia treatment, yeah.
But, to get AIDS that young, what impact did that, what toll did that take on you?
At the time, it took a huge toll, obviously, when you're 16. And the next 5 years was terrible. I was in and out of hospital all the time. Lots of different illnesses caused by the AIDS ravaging my body. But of course, those are also your most formative years. So I missed school, I missed university, I missed sort of going out and getting my first job. It was a really difficult time, and it's taken a long time in my adult life to kind of get through that and get over it.
I mean, I've got to say, I hope you don't mind me saying this, I mean, you look really pretty well now.
Thank you.
Is that the case?
I'm certainly better than I was before the medications came out. Having said that, it's not an easy ride every day. We take medications that have extreme side effects. The ones I'm on at the moment have caused osteoporosis, which has caused bone fractures, high blood pressure. Ones I've taken before have caused strokes and avascular necrosis in my hips. It's been very much a roller coaster ride to reach this point. But I'm glad to say that I'm reasonably stable at the moment, yeah.
I'm pleased to hear that. Well, let me turn now to Diana Johnson. I mean, Andy has set out so clearly there what the impact of this devastating failure has been. But successive governments were alerted to this problem and failed to act, didn't they?
Absolutely, Kathy, and you know, all governments of both colours, and even when the coalition existed with the Liberal Democrats as well, all of them failed, I think, and so today is a very important day that the Prime Minister has announced we will have a public inquiry into, as you've just heard from that explanation of the effect that this has had on Andy and his life. I mean, Andy's not alone. There are 2,400 people who've already died, and there are many thousands who have HIV and hepatitis C and various other viruses as well. So there are many people affected by this, and we need to find out what happened and why.
Well, let me turn back to Andy. I mean, the inquiry presumably gives you some comfort, does it?
I think most people today are celebrating cautiously. I think we need to absolutely get the terms of reference right for this inquiry. It must have the power to compel witnesses. It must have the power to requisition documentation from the Department of Health. And we feel that it needs to have the remit to find liability as well.
So a judicial inquiry?
We would like a judicial inquiry, but what form that takes, we will take advice on, obviously. But you know, it's going to have to be. This is the last bite at the cherry that we've got. We feel, you know, that we've been waiting for so long. We really need to get this right now.
Diana, do you back that as well? A judicial inquiry? Is that the kind of inquiry you'd like to see?
I think everything that Andy said I would support. What I'm also interested in is whether we could use the Hillsborough style of an independent panel, because that seemed to be very successful at making sure in that case that the families were fully involved in the investigation. And I think the families and those affected need to be at the heart of whatever is established to deal with this investigation. And so I'm sympathetic to the need for the forensic skills that a judge would bring, but I also think we need to make sure we've got people on the panel or with the judge who have the confidence and support of people who've been affected by this.
And obviously a lot of the evidence is not new. What does it so far point to in your view?
Well, recently Andy Burnham came forward to the House of Commons with evidence of criminal activity, tampering with medical records, testing people without telling them they were being tested, not telling them what the results were. So he's put together a dossier of criminal actions that he is taking to the police.
I should say they're allegations.
They're allegations. They're allegations, but he has a dossier. And of course, at the weekend we had the 6 party leaders in Parliament, the opposition party leaders, calling on the Prime Minister in light of new evidence to have this inquiry. So I'm just delighted today that we're at the start now of actually trying to find out what happened and answer the questions that people like Andy and my constituent Glenn Wilkinson have about what happened to them.
Andy, one of the issues, I guess, is the level of compensation that British victims have received. I mean, I think I'm right in saying somewhere between £20,000 and £63,000 per person. Contrast that with Ireland, where the average has been £275,000. Is that something you'd like to come out of this inquiry, higher compensation?
First, can I just say that we've never received any compensation at all. It's all been ex gratia payments. To have compensation, you have to have an admission of liability, and there's never been that.
I see.
So everything that we've received so far is ex gratia. It's a hardship fund in essence, and a lot of that has been it's money that we've had to beg for on a case-by-case basis. It's not been coming to us forthcoming very easily.
So you want decent compensation, proper compensation?
I won't lie to you and say that money isn't important. I think, you know, for the people, at least the people that are still alive and suffering with this at the moment, to have full compensation would certainly make their lives a lot easier.
And very briefly, I mean, it is too late for so many victims, isn't it?
Absolutely right. I mean, I was one of 250 people that are still alive out of 1,243 who got HIV. And as Diana said, overall 2,400 deaths. Yes, it's too late for a lot of people, but at least we can give their families answers to this.
An absolute tragedy. Andy Evans and Diana Johnson, thank you very much for joining me, both of you.
The wheels of justice may only be starting to turn decades after the NHS contaminated blood scandal, but it is justice. The question now is, how far will that justice reach? 2,400 people died after being given blood products infected with HIV or hepatitis C in the 70s and 80s. Many more became seriously ill. Now, at long last, the government has announced an inquiry into what's said to be the worst single scandal in NHS history. Theresa May's office called it an appalling tragedy that has caused unimaginable hardship and pain. Campaigners immediately demanded a full Hillsborough-style investigation with the possibility of criminal charges at the end of it.
I was infected with HIV, hepatitis C and hepatitis B at the age of 5.
We've been sick since childhood. We will never know the adults we could have been. We will never know the lives we could have had.
It turned out to be the biggest mistake he and all the other haemophiliacs would make in their life.
Thousands of lives lost, thousands more blighted. The greatest disaster to beset the NHS. 30 years on, the survivors will get their inquiry.
I started this battle in a room full of men who are no longer here. They have died horrible deaths. There is nothing nice about dying from liver disease. Some of them have died deaths that I wouldn't have wished on my worst enemy.
Bruce Norval contracted hepatitis C at just 5 years old. His story is horribly typical. As a haemophiliac in the 70s and 80s, he was treated with blood clotting agents that were imported and carried infection. Most of the contaminated products came from America, where donors had been paid to give blood. Potentially fatal hepatitis C infected more than 6,000 people, though some estimates put the figure far higher. While HIV has affected more than 1,500 patients, in total leading to the deaths of more than 2,400 people.
The victims and their families have suffered pain and hardship, and they deserve answers, and the inquiry that I've announced today will give them those answers, so they will know why this happened, how it happened. This was an appalling tragedy, and it should never have happened.
Baby Jason, 4 days old.
One of those who died was Jonathan Evans, whose son Jason says it's time to end the secrecy that surrounded this tragedy.
Certainly now we have to concentrate on getting the terms of reference correct, and also making sure the inquiry has the correct powers to get to the truth.
This is quite simply the worst peacetime disaster that nobody talks about.
Andy Evans was 5 when he contracted hepatitis C as a result of contaminated blood. He was later diagnosed with HIV and has campaigned for this day ever since.
This is the last chance we're going to have, we feel. If this doesn't get to the truth, I don't think there's really any fight left in anybody anymore.
The drugs that keep Andy Evans alive today have painful side effects, but he is desperate to see justice, even if it's already taken far too long. Paul Davis, News at 10.
I'm joined now by the Greater Manchester Mayor and former Labour Health Secretary Andy Burnham, who is among those who's led calls for an inquiry. Thanks very much for joining us, Mr Burnham. You were very deeply involved around the Hillsborough inquiry. Do you think that this scandal calls for an inquiry of the same kind of magnitude and scope of Hillsborough?
Yes, I do, Raggy. And there are two things that it should follow the Hillsborough model on. Number one, full disclosure of all papers held by the government, nothing at all withheld. Number two, this needs not just to look at the original negligence, but also the cover-up that followed. I believe that was a cover-up on an industrial scale, and that needs to be exposed.
And what do you think, if you call it a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale, what do you think the consequences therefore should be?
Well, first of all, like Hillsborough, we have to establish the truth. But once you've established the truth then has its own power. And as we've seen with Hillsborough, justice has followed in that case. And following justice, there then needs to be accountability. And I want to see exactly the same here. Those responsible held to account. This day has taken far, far too long in coming. All political parties have failed those affected by contaminated blood. We must now all work together to ensure they get truth and justice without any further delay.
I mean, truth and justice is what a lot of the families affected, of course, want. 2,400 people are not around as a result of this scandal. Do you think that this should also look into the question of compensation?
Yes, I do. Over the years, a few scraps have been thrown off the table towards those who've suffered. And by the way, you know, it goes far further than a couple of thousand. Many, many tens of thousands of lives have been blighted by this scandal. Children who've never seen their parents, families really torn apart. So after we've got the full truth, then finally I believe the country will come behind the victims and demand that they get proper recompense for the loss they've suffered.
And very briefly, Mr Burnham, and what about, I mean, the idea of a sort of police investigation in this?
Well, I believe the best way to get to the truth as quickly as possible is through a Hillsborough-style inquiry, and I'm pleased that that has been set up today. But as we've seen with Hillsborough, it is possible that prosecutions may eventually follow. So I would say that, you know, nothing should be off limits. I have seen evidence of a criminal cover-up. I have seen evidence of people's medical records falsified to suggest that they had caused their own liver damage, to suggest that they were alcoholic and not that the damage was caused by the negligence of the state. So all of this has to be exposed, and yes, this should result in prosecutions if the evidence supports it.
Andy Burnham, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Between 1970 and 1991, around 6,000 people became infected with hepatitis C after receiving blood products from the NHS. Another 1,500 were infected with HIV. Most had been receiving treatment for haemophilia. More than 2,000 are since believed to have died. In the 10 years since then, governments have apologised, and some of those who suffered received compensations. But calls for a public inquiry into the scandal have fallen on deaf ears. Today, that changed when Theresa May announced unexpectedly to her cabinet that she would order an inquiry, precise format to be confirmed. The move may not have been entirely unconnected with the threat to the Prime Minister that she's facing potentially losing a Commons vote in an emergency vote, emergency motion on the subject. Tonight, she said this.
I want to ensure that this inquiry is going to provide the answers that the victims and their families want as to how this was able to happen. And it's affected so many people, and they have waited too long for these answers. What we want to do is talk with the families, talk to them about the shape that this inquiry should take, so we ensure that it is able to provide the answers and the justice that they want and deserve.
One of those who's been waiting almost 2 decades for light to be shone onto the scandal of the NHS's contaminated blood is Lauren Palmer. Her father, Stephen, was a haemophiliac who contracted hepatitis C and HIV through a contaminated blood transfusion in the mid-1980s. Before he realised he had unknowingly passed HIV to his wife, Barbara, And when Lauren was just 9 years old, she lost both her parents in the space of 8 days. Lauren, having gone through that terrible tragedy, did you feel also that you were growing up with a stigma?
Massively. I remember being told that I couldn't even breathe a word of what had happened, just with the association of the stigma around HIV alone. So I never spoke of it when I was younger at all. It's only really recent, in the last couple of years, that I've sort of been more open about it, especially within my job as well. At the moment, it's quite encouraged because their charity is all based around HIV as well. So I've begun to sort of start telling my story. But yes, growing up, I literally just couldn't talk about it.
Who did you go and live with after this had happened?
I was taken into care by legal guardianship of my auntie and my uncle, so my mother's sister at the time.
What does today's announcement mean to you?
Oh, such a relief. It couldn't have been better news. I know for a fact that so many people have been fighting for this outcome for many, many years. I'm one of the lucky ones. I've literally just come into the campaign off the back of the Panorama TV show, but there have been people that have been relentlessly fighting and continually campaigning for this for such a long time, and I'm beyond happy with the results today. It wasn't expected. So it was even more of a relief, I think, for us all.
Well, you say it wasn't expected, and it's 20 years. I mean, presumably for much of your life, you've gone through just assuming this thing would never be properly dealt with and you'd never receive a real explanation of everything that had happened and why.
No, no. So this is really, well, yeah, like you say, very unexpected, but we are over the moon with it, and it's just the beginning now. It's still going to take a long time, a long fight to get the real truth and justice and answers from what actually happened.
What's the end point of that process for you? Is it seeing people in the dock? Is it literally prosecutions?
It's closure for all of us that have been affected and the people that have been infected, that no one's been accountable for it. That's really ultimately what everyone wants. They want to know why it happened, how a mistake on this magnitude can occur, and just us wanting answers. That's all we want. We just want the justice and the system to be.
And if that means people being in court, taken to court, as happened in France, for example,
yeah,
then that's part of that process for you, isn't it?
It is, yes.
To what extent did your parents understand the cause of what had happened to them, and to what extent would they have wanted to see this day?
I know my mum was fighting for about 3 years before she passed away, and she never got anywhere with it. It was then passed on to my aunt, who then continually tried to find answers and fight for that for, I know, for a good few years. And then again, that fell on deaf ears. It didn't really amount to anything. So now I'm holding that flag for my mum, doing it for her and doing it for all the other families that have been affected by this as well. It's a real community out there now, and we all want the same thing, and that's what we all want.
Lauren, thank you so much for explaining that to us.
Thank you for having me.